All right, so look. Here's where the postmodernists are wrong. I think there's 3 places, and there's serious errors. The first is that there is an infinite number of interpretations, but there is not an infinite number of viable interpretations. There's a very finite number of viable interpretations, and I don't think that this is theory. I think that game theorists have already demonstrated this to some degree, and it's going to be built into AI systems very rapidly. Okay, so what are the constraints? Okay, first of all, you can't have an interpretation that leads immediately to your death or you're dead. Now, if you want to be dead, that's fine, but if you don't want to be, then you've got a lot of limited options, right? You don't get to run naked across an 8-lane freeway at night blindfolded, because probably you'll be dead. That's a bad interpretation. Okay, so you might say, because you're fragile and vulnerable and mortal, that there's a limited number of ways that you can look at the world that don't result in, let's say, death or serious damage or agony. That's a bad thing. Agony is a bad thing. Most people agree on that. So you're constrained by pain and anxiety. At least your interpretations are constrained by pain and anxiety. And you know, you can make pain worse or better by thinking about it to some degree, but only to some degree. When push comes to shove, pain is your master. Okay, so that's a big constraint. That's a big constraint. Well, but the constraints are worse than that, because not only do you not get to have an interpretation of the world that produces anxiety and suffering right now, but you don't get to have an interpretation of the world that, if you iterate it across time, produces pain and suffering. And so that's a big problem, because there's lots of, you could go out tonight and get yourself blind drunk on cocaine and sleep with 6 hookers. And you know, maybe that'd be a good night, you know. You might not think about it being so good tomorrow, but then maybe you're dead of AIDS in a year. Or maybe you're addicted to cocaine, or maybe you're a street alcoholic, or whatever. It's like, as an iterable game, that's downhill. And the thing is, you play iterated games. You don't play one, you play iterated games. And so your interpretation of the world has to be one that will sustain multiple iterations across time. Because you have to worry about 40-year-old you and 60-year-old you. And that's a big problem. That's a lot of yous stretched over a long period of time. And it's worse than that, because it's not just you. It's like you and your family, right? And not only do you have to take care of yourself now in a manner that allows you to take care of yourself when you're 40, you have to take care of yourself now in a manner that takes care of you when you're 40, so that other people are happy to have you around now and continually, so that they'll cooperate and compete with you in a positive way. And so that's getting ridiculously complicated. It's not just you now and you in the future. It's you surrounded by other people doing the same thing now and in the future. And there's a lot of other people. It can't even just be you and your family. You know, like the psychopathic burglar mob. That's just not going to go so well, right? Other people are going to object, and the world's going to object. And so fine, there's an infinite number of interpretations. That doesn't mean there's an infinite number of viable interpretations. In fact, there are hardly any. There are hardly any playable games. Now, Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, who's a very smart guy, he pointed out something very interesting. He said, imagine you ran a set of iterated games as a competition. And in one iterated game, the rule was, you bloody well do what I tell you to. And the other one is, well, we'll all get together and decide how we're going to do this. Okay, now we run the competition. Now, Piaget's claim is, you do what I tell you fails. And the reason for that is I have to impose force in order to keep you cooperating. And the imposition of force is a cost. It's an efficiency cost. And across time, that efficiency cost is going to multiply. And the equilibrated state solution, which is the one where we all agree, it wins. Now that's worth thinking about. You think about that locally. So you're trying to organize your family. You have a little family conference about who's doing what in the household. And if you want peace and harmony and an iterated game, you get everybody to say, well, here's the tasks, and they have to be done. People have to agree on that. And then you say, well, which task would you do? You have to do some. How about you? And, you know, which task would you do? And everybody agrees. And then you say, well, unless you can come up with a better solution, that's the one we're going to go with. And then people can be a little resentful and angry about the conditions of existence where they have to work, but they can't really blame that on anyone else. And maybe that's the best solution you can come up with. And that was Piaget's idea of the equilibrated state. It was like, It's a voluntary agreement that can be iterated across time that works at multiple levels of social organization. Man, that's a serious, serious, serious set of constraints. And Piaget, by the way, was looking for a way to reconcile science and religion. He was looking for a biological origin to morality, and he thought he found it in the idea of the equilibrated state. And it's even deeper than that. So imagine this equilibrated state idea is actually, there's something to it. That if you set the state up properly, it will iterate across time so long that it becomes a permanent part of the environment. A hierarchy is that's exactly what a hierarchy is. Hierarchies are 350 million years old. They're not the patriarchal invention of white European Christian males in the last 300 years. They're 350 million years old. They're stable solutions to this iterated game problem. And they've been around so long that we're actually adapted to them. And that's part of the reason we have archetypal representations of the social structure. So, and we also have archetypal representations of the relationship of the individual to the social structure. Your job as an individual in relationship to the social structure is to embody the social structure, but also to serve as its eyes and its mouth, so that it can update itself when necessary. So you take on the mantle of your father, let's say, but he's dead. He's the past. He can't see. You can see. So you take the structure that's already there and you modify it where it's necessary. And that modification process is necessary, or the state becomes too static and collapses. And that's why the state has to be subordinate to the individual. And that's what Western culture has discovered. And we can't just let it go. That's the idea of the logos. That's a big idea. And you want to live somewhere where the individual is subordinate to the state. It's like, hey, go right ahead. There's lots of places like that, man. Emigrate. Go there. 90% of the world's countries are like that. If you want to live like that, man, go find out what it's like. You don't see immigration going there, that's for sure. Okay, so that's a big mistake that the postmodernists made. It's not trivial, that's a big mistake, but it's not the only one. Well, here's another one. They don't like inequality. Well, who does? I'm against poverty. You know, that's like classic protest sign. It's like, really? It's like, I'm against torture. It's like, it's so obvious. You don't get any brownie points for being against poverty. No one in their right mind is for poverty. You know, you ever watch The Simpsons? You ever see the Republican Party in The Simpsons? They all meet in an old haunted castle at night with like lightning bolts going off, and there's a vampire and a crazy Texan. And even the Simpson Republicans don't sit around in the haunted tower at midnight saying, hey, we need more poverty. Here's an interesting thing. So one of the postmodernist claims is that diversity is necessary. And they make it racial, and they make it sexual, and they make it ethnic, and all of that. That's actually technically incorrect, by the way, because I study individual differences, so those are the differences between people. And I know the literature, so you know about James Damore's memo, right, from Google. He wrote that partly because he was watching my videos, which is why he wanted me to interview him. And I'm a believer that there are biological differences in temperament between men and women, apart from the other obvious differences, and that they're actually not trivial. And that they maximize in the societies that have moved farthest to producing egalitarian states, the Scandinavian countries, and that the reason for that is that there's two reasons why men and women differ in temperament. One is biological and the other is environmental. And if you remove the environmental variation, which you do if you make the state egalitarian, you maximize the genetic variation. And that's been demonstrated in the scientific literature over about 4 decades. And no one wanted it or hoped for it, and they weren't biased in looking for it, because that was exactly the opposite of what social scientists wanted to find. Because social scientists lean heavily to the left, and what they wanted to find was you flatten out the state so that everyone has equal opportunity, and the differences between people disappear. That is not what happened. The opposite happened. That was wrong. And no one was happy about it. And no one's happy about it now. You can actually tell when you've discovered something in a social science, because you're not happy about it. But if you take, let's say, there's a big difference between men and women in terms of trait agreeableness, compassion and politeness. On average, women are more agreeable than men. And the difference is approximately this. If you take random pairs of men and women out of the population, let's say you had to make a bet on who was more agreeable. If you bet that it was the woman, you'd be right 60% of the time. Well, that's not that much. It means you'd be wrong 40% of the time. That's almost 50% of the time. So this is a big difference by social science standards, but that's the magnitude of the difference. There are some differences that are bigger, like the difference between men and women's interest in people versus things is actually bigger than that. That's the biggest difference we know. But it's a big difference, let's say, the agreeableness difference, but still, the shared attributes of men and women far outweigh the attributes that differentiate them. Because you could ask, are there more differences within groups or between them? Now, the postmodern answer to that is between them. That's why you need diversity by group, right? That's why you need different races. That's why you need different ethnicities and sexual preferences and all of that. Well, that's wrong. There's more difference within the groups than there is between them. You don't get diversity by crossing the groups. You get diversity by selecting across individuals. In fact, the idea that there is more differences between groups than there is between individuals is actually the fundamental racist idea. It's the fundamental racist idea, which is, well, let's say you're Asian, Oriental, to use the old word to discriminate the one type of Asian, say, from the other. You're so different from me that there's no overlap between our groups. And you're also so different, and there's so little difference within your group that now that I know that you're not me, you're not one of mine, I actually know what you're like. No. Technically, that's incorrect. That's wrong. That isn't how you get diversity. Now, diversity is actually necessary because people differ in intelligence and they differ in temperament and they differ in skills, and so you actually need diversity because otherwise you can't take advantage of all those differences. So you need diversity, but you need genuine diversity. And like, what would genuine diversity mean? If you're trying to put together a work team, you want people of sufficient diversity so that they more or less, so that you gather together the appropriate talents to produce the implement that's necessary to work properly in the world. That's a competence marker. Because otherwise your business is going to fail. And so the proper diversity with regards to employment is the diversity that meets the requirements of the business, essentially. Obviously. That's why you try to hire people carefully and not randomly, let's say. Third error. First error is there's only a finite number of valid interpretations. Second error is that there are real differences between groups of people, but there's more difference within the groups than between them. Third difference is social status and payment, especially in a free, democratic, capitalist society, is based more on competence than on power. In fact, we would say that when a person in a hierarchy starts to act like their position entitles them to power, then that hierarchy has become corrupt. Harvey Weinstein's a good example of that. I'm serious. It's like he acted like a tyrant. What happened to him? It's not good. Not good for him. What he did was not good. But it's an indication, it's revealed, it's an indication that the misuse. So he's competent, fine, he gets to have position because we need people who are competent. But that doesn't mean you get to turn into a tyrant. If you turn into a tyrant, then that overshadows your competence and out you go. That's the definition of a functioning state. And our state essentially functions. It's not perfect, that's for sure. But compared to what? That's the issue. Compared to your hypothetical Marxist utopia. Well, compared to your hypothetical Marxist utopia, I mean, we're living in Auschwitz, but your actual Marxist utopia is indistinguishable from Auschwitz. So we're not listening to that comparison. We're going to take a look at what we have and we're going to compare it to other places that actually existed in time and geographically. And by those criteria, it's like, is there another time you'd rather live? Is there another place you'd rather live? I mean, a real place in a real time. I mean, you want to live back in 1895, even in the Western world, where the average person lived on less than $1 a day in today's money? You want to live like those coal miners? It's like the answer to that's no. If you have any sense, you should have some gratitude. That's another problem with the postmodern neo-Marxists, like zero gratitude. It's all, oh my God, I'm oppressed.